And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He rises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his kings and exalt the horn of his anointed.
Good morning. It's great to see you, and happy Mother's Day to all of our mothers. You know, motherhood is truly, it is such a beauty. The nurture and care that moms give to their children, the strength that moms have to always be there for their children, the bond that is formed between a mom and her child because they are formed in her in the womb. All of motherhood is really a depiction, it is a reflection of God and who He is. But there are challenges of motherhood that sometimes can be overwhelming. There may come a sense that a woman's identity is being stripped away and all that she is becoming is just a runny-nose wiper, a short-order cook, transportation specialist, and a boo-boo bandager. And it can feel like their sole purpose is just to try to raise godly children. But I would say to you, that's not the purpose of a mother. The purpose of a mother is just like all of us, and that is to love God more and more. And thus that means that a godly motherhood is the product of fulfilling that purpose of loving God more by knowing Him better. I was reading an article this week on that idea of motherhood, and one woman said it this way: "Dear mommies, we are so much more than the summation of our children. His purpose for you, for your motherhood, is that you would know Him better, love Him more, depend completely on His strength, and understand His faithfulness in a new way. God made you a mom to draw you deeper into His love and His story. The raising of godly, happy, loved children is a gracious result of your deepening relationship with God." And the more that I got to thinking about that, the more that I realized that Hannah is really a reflection of that very statement. And so for a moment this morning, I'd like for us to just turn to 1 Samuel chapter 1, where we see the story of Hannah. So turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 1. And the context that we find this is in the time of the judges. And so in the time of the judges, actually at the very end of the book of Judges, it is said that there is no king in Israel at this time, and everyone does what is right in their own eyes. So, really, you have a time of chaos. There's no leader. Everybody just says, well, this is what I want to do. And so they go and do it. But what we find is now this story. And I'll pick up the reading there in verse 1. It says, "Now there was a certain man from Ramathaim Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children." So starting off, we have here Elkanah, who is a godly man. As we will see in just a moment, he is seeking to lead his family. He goes up to the places of worship at Shiloh as he's requested to. But he doesn't follow God's will completely. He has 2 wives. Hannah, her name actually means favor or grace. And then Peninnah actually means pearl or coral. And when we see this idea of polygamy going on, multiple wives. And you see that a lot in the Bible, but that doesn't mean that the Bible condones that. What you typically see, I would say all the time, when there are multiple wives, it is usually joined together with sorrow and suffering. Now, when we see this, this should already just draw us back to Genesis, where we have stories of very similar, of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, or Jacob and Rachel and Leah. And that Hannah is like Sarah and Rachel in that she is favored, but she is barren. And so we see Hannah as a woman of faith. Picking up the reading in verse 3, it says, "Now this man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to Yahweh of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to Yahweh there. When the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah. But Yahweh had closed her womb. Her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her, because Yahweh had closed her womb. It happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of Yahweh, she would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, 'Hannah, why do you weep, and why do you not eat, and why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?'" So we see this woman of faith here. We see Hannah faithfully endured real problems. I don't know that I can even fathom what that would be like to be in a relationship where you are constantly fighting with another woman for the love of your husband. And on top of that, that she cannot have children. A lot of scholars have said that it was possible that Elkanah married Hannah first. And because she couldn't have children, he went and married Peninnah then so that he could carry on his line, his lineage. But the very idea we see here is that, especially in this culture, having children was a sign of favor. The children were the ones who carried on the family name, the inheritance. And while Elkanah favored Hannah, we might say that society disfavored her, or she was a social disgrace because she could not have children. But what we see is that she worshiped even though that was a reminder of her disgrace. Throughout the year, all of the times that the Lord required of the Israelites to go up and have a feast, the feast was to be a time of celebrating celebration of God and what He's done, and commemorating and communing together. But yet, as we see here, every single time, that would have been a reminder to Hannah. She doesn't have children. And yet she continues to go. She doesn't hold back. She doesn't say, I'm not going to go worship my God because it reminds me of what I don't have. She continues faithfully to go and worship. It's interesting here that Elkanah, as he is there at the feasts, he would give out the portions. He would give it out to Peninnah, and he would give out the portions to her sons and her daughters. And then it says that Elkanah would then give the double portion to Hannah, showing his love for her and everything. And yet he's going against the law of Moses for that. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 21 especially, where it says, if you have multiple wives and you have one that has your firstborn child, but you want to show more love to another wife, he says you can't do it. You have to give the double portion to the firstborn. So Elkanah is breaking that law here as he is trying to show compassion and love to Hannah. And yet we see that her barrenness was from Yahweh. It says it twice here. That this is a test of her faith. It's not that Yahweh is trying to trap her in it. It is a test, just like we see with Abraham. Are you going to hold to the Lord, or are you going to let go of Him? And so we see this test. And on top of that, she has this rival, Peninnah. Not just for a month, not just for a year, but this goes on for years. That she is being prodded, she's being provoked, she's being irritated. It's interesting there, the wording there, provoke means to stir to anger. The word irritate means literally to cause to roar or thunder. Can you imagine the back and forth between these two women? And I don't necessarily put it all on Peninnah from the standpoint of, think about what Peninnah sees. Her sons don't get the double portion. So she's recognizing, wait a minute, there's this jockeying for position here. And continually then Peninnah is provoking Hannah because of her barrenness. Hannah found no comfort for her sorrow. Again, this should draw us back to earlier stories. It says there in the chapter that Hannah was afflicted. The word afflicted there is the same word that is used for Hagar when she was afflicted by Sarah. And so that same theme is being carried through, but there's a twist on it here because now Hannah is the favored one, and yet she is the oppressed one. That Hannah is like Sarah in having no kids, and yet she is like Hagar in that she is oppressed. And then Elkanah comes. Elkanah is not very sensitive. Because he makes this statement, Hannah, aren't I better than 10 sons? Guys, that is not the thing to say to your wife. Just period. Just don't say that. But that's where he is. I mean, and so Hannah, she has no comfort for her sorrow. He's trying to, Elkanah's trying to fix the problem rather than listen. And there are times when our suffering is so great that no one can help but the Lord. And we see that Hannah was a woman of prayer because she came before the Lord. Notice verse 9. Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of Yahweh. She greatly distressed, prayed to Yahweh, and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Yahweh of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to Yahweh all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Notice as she comes here, she comes before Yahweh. But she comes and she brings her distresses before him. Even when, as we're already told twice in this, that this we might call unfavoredness, this barrenness is from the Lord. She still goes to him because she recognizes this is the relationship that she has with Yahweh. That only He can be the one to help her in this time of need. She's broken by the provoking and the suffering. And so she comes, and as we'll see in a moment, she comes not drinking wine, but instead she pours herself out before Yahweh. She understood that she could do nothing of her own, but came seeking His power and authority. And she makes a vow to God. She says, if you will give me a son, I will give him back to you. Think about what she's saying there. She actually goes even further and she says, a razor shall never come on his head. That's in reference to the Nazirite vow. That is saying it is taking on a calling, a holiness, a lifestyle like that of the high priest. And so she is saying, if you will give me a son, I will give him back to you, Yahweh, and that he will work in your service like a high priest, even though he is not from the tribe of Levi. Again, think about the similarities that we see here. Abraham and Sarah, they so wanted this child of promise, that they then took it upon themselves to try to get that child through Hagar. That all fell through because God says, no, it is going to be through Sarah. And then they have this child, and then they are so enamored with it that God says, I need to test you. I need to see, will you give up your firstborn and kill him? The same thing is there for Hannah, but Hannah is not forced to do it. Hannah openly surrenders her child. She says, if you will give him to me, I will give him to you. Think about what she is surrendering. In that she's surrendering her life, her fortunes, her future, because all of that came through the Son. But she gives it all to God. And she prayed in faith. Notice what we see there, beginning in verse 12. Now it came about as she continued praying before Yahweh, that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Then Eli said to her, how long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. But Hannah replied, no, my Lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before Yahweh. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation. Then Eli answered and said, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him. And she said, let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. It's interesting there in verse 12 where it says she continued praying. The idea there is not just that she was praying one prayer, but that she was praying, the word there is multiple. She was praying literally multiplied. Her prayers, multiple prayers were multiplied there before God. And that she's so focused on Yahweh at this time, as she's pouring herself out, that her lips are moving, but the voice is not coming out. And Eli sees this and thinks she's drunk. Which to me I think is probably a commentary on the culture of the day. That he's almost like just used to people getting drunk at the tabernacle. And he's like, just stop that. She says, that's not it at all. She says, I am pouring out my heart before Yahweh. When Eli sees this, he says, go in peace, that God would grant you your petition. And from that moment, her countenance changed. She goes and she eats, and it says she's no longer sad. What's going on there? Well, she prayed having faith that God would answer. That is a challenge for us in our prayers, to pray in that manner. Some of us, sometimes we pray and we say, God, I hope you're going to do this. I want you to do this. But there's not the trust that God is going to do that. But notice how Jesus says this in Mark chapter 11 and verse 24. He says, therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Hannah prayed, and she believed. She didn't receive it yet. She had no evidence that she was going to receive it, but she believed it, that was going to be true. And God answered. God remembered Hannah. In verse 19 and 20, then they arose early in the morning and worshiped before Yahweh and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. It came about in due time after Hannah had conceived that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of Yahweh. Hannah, because of her faith, experienced God's provisions. That God gave Hannah a son. And she named him Samuel, which means God listens. As she says there, God listens because I have asked of him. For us as children of God, we need to understand that God is going to answer our prayers. It may not be in the way that we want it. It may be in some completely different way. It may be in a time frame that is not what we want. But God will answer our prayers. And He will meet our needs so that we experience His provisions. You see, God brought about His purpose through Samuel. God answered her prayer not just so that she could have a child, but so that a prophet could come and carry out the purpose of God. You see, God allowed a time of barrenness for Hannah so that it would bring greater blessings than she could possibly imagine. God uses our affliction many times to accomplish greater things. And notice we see Hannah then in faith kept her promise. There are times where people say things, but they don't carry through. But notice what Hannah does. Verse 21, then the man Elkanah went up with all his household to offer to Yahweh the yearly sacrifice and pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned. Then I will bring him, that he may appear before Yahweh and stay there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Remain until you have weaned him, only may Yahweh confirm His word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. Now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, with a 3-year-old bull and 1 ephah of flour and a jug of wine, and brought him to the house of Yahweh in Shiloh, although the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli. She said, O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to Yahweh. For this boy I prayed, and Yahweh has given me my petition, which I asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to Yahweh. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to Yahweh. And he worshiped Yahweh there. Notice what we see here. Hannah planned to keep her vow. As I said, sometimes there are people who say things, Lord, if you'll just get me out of this situation, then I'll do this. And then they tend to go back on their word. That was not Hannah at all. But also notice what that involved. It involved that there had to come an agreement between Hannah and Elkanah. We're not told that Elkanah knew of her vow when she asked it of the Lord. Elkanah could have had every right to say, no, he is my son, he will stay with me. But that's not the case. They both together were in agreement that, yes, this is the vow that you have said, this is the vow that will be carried out. And then she prepared Samuel to carry out the vow. She nursed and nurtured Samuel to get him ready to serve before the Lord. And I think that is just as much from a physical standpoint as it is a spiritual standpoint. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 6 and 7, it says, Therefore God says, I command you today that this shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. All of that, this is what Hannah is doing for Samuel. Because notice there in verse 28, it says there, not just that they were the ones worshiping, it says Samuel worshiped Yahweh there. Even at a young age, she's developing his heart to have a love for God. And what we see is that carries out through the rest of the story of Samuel. God appears visibly to Samuel. And I think it is in part because of what she has done, the preparation that she did for her son. And then she fulfilled her vow. As she dedicated herself to her child, she also dedicated her child to the Lord. Twice in verse 28 there it says that she is dedicating him to the Lord, confirming her commitment. And I think it is because she realized that Samuel did not belong to her, but to the Lord. And that's probably a lesson for all of us as parents to learn. Is our children are not our own. We may think that they are, but they are a gift from God, put into our stewardship. And our job is to guide them to Jesus, to guide them to Yahweh. And that's what Hannah did. And therein is the love of a mother, a sacrifice of herself for the sake of her son. That Hannah loved him so much that she was willing to forego a mother's greatest joy of bringing up her son and having him around her. She gave that up because of the relationship that she had with Yahweh. And she was committed to do whatever it took for Samuel to reach his godly potential. And we see that she still had contact with him. Chapter 2 and verse 19 says she would bring him robes and things to wear. But she gave him over to God. And what we see is that she was a woman of praise. It says there that Hannah gave glory to Yahweh. In chapter 2, we're not going to read it all. Elias did a great job of reading it earlier. But notice the difference here. If I try to put myself in Hannah's shoes, I have to think that there's going to be a sense of grief. That I'm mourning the loss of my child, that I won't have those memories. I won't hear him around my table. And yet that's not what Hannah does. Hannah instead is overcome by joy. Hannah, as we look at this prayer of praise, she starts off in verses 1 and 2, and she's celebrating Yahweh. Because she sees it as He has given me victory. That's that whole idea of the exaltation and raising her horn. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies, saying, she's won this victory because of Yahweh. And then in verses 3 through 10, she turns what God has done for her and says, I see now that this is how He works in the world. And what we see is a number of what we would say inversions. Notice so many of them: the warrior and the weak, the food and hungry, barren and fruitful, death and life, rich and poor. All of these, the world would say, oh, it's the strong, it's the ones who have food, it's the ones who are fruitful, who have life, all of that. And yet she says that's not how God works. She says God works with those who are lowly, those who are weak and oppressed. She says, I've seen it in my life, and that this is how God works in the world to bring about His purpose. He elevates the lowly and brings down those who elevate themselves. So as we close this morning, I want us to just go back to that quote that I had before, where Maggie Combe says, His purpose, speaking of God, His purpose for your motherhood is that you would know Him better, love Him more, depend completely on His strength, and understand His faithfulness in a new way. I think Hannah came to understand this as she was a woman of faith, a woman of prayer, and a woman of praise. And that the raising of her godly children was a gracious result of her deepening relationship with Yahweh. I think what Hannah shows us is the need to grow our relationship with Yahweh. If we want that in our children's lives, if we want them to know God, if we want them to come and love God, then that has to be first and foremost evident in our lives, because we are the example for them. So today we truly honor mothers for all that they do for us, because that is a reflection of who God is and what He has done for us. And when you think about it, He gave up His Son to identify with the lowly, with the weak, with the oppressed. He gave up His Son to identify with us and die for us, so that we might be exalted and lifted up and have a relationship with Him. That's what our God has done for us this morning. Do you know Him? Do you love Him the way Hannah loved Him? His invitation is open to each and every one. He says, I have given it all for you so that you can be my child. Are you struggling this morning? Is there something in your life that you are just wrestling with? We can pray with you. And if you need to answer the invitation of our Lord, to become His child, to be baptized into Him, His death, burial, and resurrection, so that you can have a brand new life, that invitation is open to you. Won't you come as together we stand and sing?